Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we are looking at two texts for the second week of Advent in year B on the lectionary cycle. The first text is from Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 through 11. And the second text is the gospel reading, Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And I will begin in just a few seconds. Okay, again, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We're looking at two readings for this Sunday, Isaiah 40 and Mark chapter 1. Both are on the lectionary cycle for year B during Advent. So I want to begin with the first of the three P's. The first P is prayer, and this is a Celtic prayer titled Mothering God. From the moment I was born in your mind, I've been loved, adored, precious, a little miracle of life. As your child, you cherish me, and you would protect me with a fierce love, like a lioness with her cub. Inside of me every day, there's a part that needs to know I'm treasured like this. Amen. Okay, the second P is perspective. And those of you who have tuned into these live stream studies, or if you've gone back and watched at a more convenient time, you know that I spend a little bit of time each week talking about perspective because it's incredibly interesting to me to see how people go about reading and interpreting the Bible. That whole process is fascinating. And I'm very much interested in the lenses that we construct or that are constructed for us that shape how we read the Bible and how we interpret it. So today's perspective comes from Richard Rohr in this book. It's called Yes and it's a series of daily meditations. And it's consistent with the prayer that I just read, the prayer Mothering God, because here Richard Rohr talks about how our understanding of God actually shapes our sense of identity. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from what he writes here. Your image of God creates you or defeats you. There is an absolute connection between how you see God and how you see yourself and the whole universe. The word God is, first of all, a stand-in for everything, reality, truth, and the very shape of your universe. This is why theology is important and why good theology and spirituality can make so much difference in how you live your daily life in this world. Theology is not just theoretical, but ends up being quite practical, practically upbuilding or practically defeating. After years of giving and receiving spiritual direction, says Richard Rohr, it has become obvious to me and to many of my colleagues that most people's operative de facto image of God is initially a subtle combination of their mom and their dad or other early authority figures. Without an interior journey of prayer or experience, much of religion is largely childhood conditioning, which God surely understands and uses. But many former believers rightly react against this because such religion is so childish and often fear-based, even if their arguments are blowing down a straw man. The goal, of course, is to grow toward an adult religion that includes reason, faith, and inner experience you can trust. A mature God creates mature people. A big God creates big people. If your mom was punitive, your God is usually punitive too, and you actually spend much of your life submitting to that punitive God or angrily reacting against it. If your dad or your minister or your early religion teachers were cold and withdrawn, you will assume that God is cold and also withdrawn. If all authority in your life came through males, you probably prefer a male image of God, even if your heart says otherwise. As we were taught in scholastic philosophy, whatever is received into something is received according to the condition of the receiver. This is one of those things hidden in plain sight, but it still remains well hidden to most Christians. So that's Richard Rohr talking about how the image of God that we hold shapes our own sense of identity, and also the image of God that we have has been constructed for us in many ways because of childhood experiences. So he's delving a little bit into psychoanalysis there. Our understanding of a father figure shapes how we see God. Our experiences of our fathers or our experiences of our mothers also can shape how we understand God, because one of the prevailing images of God in the Bible is God as parent, whether father or mother. So naturally, how we were raised by our parents shapes how we understand God. But what I love about what he says is a big God creates big people. So for Advent 2, the second week of Advent, this coming Sunday, one of the texts we're looking at is Isaiah chapter 40. And one of the beautiful aspects of Isaiah chapter 40 is that it takes us into the heart of God. The prophet's first words in Isaiah 40 are comfort, words of comfort from God. And these are words of comfort that are designed to speak to the specific situation of the people of Israel at the time. So this is the 6th century BCE, and the people of Israel have been languishing in exile in the country or the nation of Babylon. And the natural question that comes to mind for them is, where is God? And is this thing that we're doing in terms of our religion even relevant anymore? So they're in a position of uncertainty and also suffering. And it's in the midst of those circumstances and those questions that this prophet rumbles out and announces the first words from this prophet's mouth are comfort, speaking on behalf of God. So what the prophet is doing is taking us into the very heart of God and God's own desire for this suffering people. God's desire is for them to be comforted. So this is a parental image of God as cosmic comforter, and yet so intimately close, like a nursing mother. One of the greatest books in the 20th century in all of biblical studies is a book on the prophets by a scholar named Abraham Heschel. And I happen to have it right here. So this is it. It's a fantastic book because of the various insights that Heschel draws out from his study of the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament. One of the things that he says about the prophets is that what makes them so provocative is that they embody what he calls the pathos of God. That is God's feeling or emotional side, God's longing for relationship with human beings. And so one of the things Heschel says is that the fundamental experience of a prophet in the Old Testament is a fellowship with the feelings of God. That is a sympathy with this divine pathos. So what Heschel says is that Hebrew prophets both hear God's voice somehow inside of them, and at the same time, they feel God's heart. And I think that's a powerful insight when thinking about the Hebrew prophets and bringing it back to Isaiah chapter 40 and seeing how the prophet pulls us into the very heart of God and God's desire that people experience comfort and consolation in the midst of trials. So the prophets speak of and for a big God, to use Richard Rohr's expression. And if Richard Rohr is correct, that our image of God in a way creates and shapes us, then the big God we encounter in the Hebrew prophets can actually help to ground us spiritually and help to foster compassion and pathos toward our fellow human beings. So a big God, says Rohr, creates big people. So that's the perspective for today. And that brings us to the third P, which is pieces of Scripture. And again, we're looking at two today. The first is from Isaiah 40, and the second is from Mark chapter 1. So we'll start with Isaiah 40, and it's the first 11 verses. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." A voice says, "Cry out." And I said, "What shall I cry?" All people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good tidings. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. Lift it up, do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. His reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd, and he will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead the mother sheep. Okay, so a couple of things about this. First of all, if you just look at how this text is laid out in Isaiah, you'll notice a clear difference between chapters 39 and the earlier chapters, at least the most immediately early chapters, and how chapter 40 and following is laid out. So what you're seeing, again, if you're using the NRSV Bible, you'll see this. What you're seeing is a different type of Hebrew writing. So in the later chapters of Isaiah, from 37 to 39, the way the text is lined out is according to Hebrew prose, historical prose. So it's very matter-of-fact language. It's speaking factually and historically and telling a story. But then the tone shifts when you get to chapter 40, and you can see it in the way that it's lined out differently on the page. That's because Isaiah 40 begins a long section of Hebrew poetry. So we have a change in tone, a change in style, and we also have a change in prophet. So most scholars acknowledge that the first 39, or a good chunk of the first 39 chapters of this larger book that we call Isaiah, those first 39 chapters, most of them were written by an 8th century BCE prophet named Isaiah. But once we get to chapter 40, we have an entirely different historical context. The context is from the 6th century BCE, and the context is exile. So the people are now in Babylon. And so it's a different prophet who begins to speak. And in fact, many of these prophecies starting in chapter 40 may have been sung. So it's a different prophet with a different style and a different kind of a message. It's a message of consolation, but also it's a message that really exalts Israel's God, because one of the issues that the people may have been wrestling with at the time is, where is God? Because in the ancient world, if you and your capital city, if you were exiled, your capital city was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, what that meant in the ancient world was that the conquering army's god or gods were stronger than your god or gods. And that your God, in fact, was taken into exile by this conquering foe. And so you would have a bit of a theological crisis. And it is easy for us to imagine the Israelites having that same kind of struggle when they're thinking about who God is. So one of the features of what we call second Isaiah, starting in chapter 40, is this exaltation of Israel's God, and at the same time, this powerful, pastoral, compassionate message that is issued from the very heart of God for the people. And it's a message of consolation. So the first word out of this prophet's mouth in chapter 40 is comfort. So we have a clear shift in tone and in message and in style from the first 39 chapters of, and then chapters 40 and following we refer to as second Isaiah. And then some scholars will argue that starting in chapter 55, we actually have a third prophet called third Isaiah. And that would go from chapter 55 to chapter 66. But the point is that this is a composite book. The book of Isaiah is 66 chapters, but it's split up over several centuries. And multiple prophets have been active or were active in helping to bring this book about. We actually have an early copy of the book of Isaiah that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that dates to about the 2nd century BCE. So that gives us the date likely compiled by. It had to have been compiled by at least the 2nd century BCE, and probably a little bit earlier than that. So you have from the 8th century all the way till the 2nd century, this book is being worked on and brought about in the way that we have it now. So for today's reading, chapter 40, verses 1 through 11, we can actually split it up into 2 larger sections. So verses 1 through 2 are a message of comfort and consolation. And these verses tend to focus on, or at least presume, the context of the past for the people. So the trauma of exile that has brought them to their present situation and the uncertainty about where to go in the future. And so the first message, the first chunk of verses 1 through 11 is a message of comfort and consolation. But then it shifts starting in verse 3 all the way to verse 11. And the tone shifts toward preparation and even expectation for something new to happen, something that God's self will do for the people. So it starts with a message of comfort and consolation in the first part, but then it shifts to this message of preparation and expectation for the arrival of God. So in the first 2 verses, you have this message of comfort spoken twice by the prophet. Comfort my people. So it's designed to speak to these people in exile. And then in verse 2, to really emphasize the pathos, the emotion, the passion of the prophet speaks tenderly to Jerusalem. Literally, it's speaking to the heart of the people. So speaking tenderly is sort of a gloss in English translation. Literally, though, it's heart language. It's trying to get right into the guts of the people, the deep emotion that they're feeling. So that, again, that's the first part of chapter 40. It's this message of consolation that speaks directly to the heart of the people. And then preparation and expectation takes off starting in verse 3. And again, the promise is that God will arrive. God will be present. And so one of the reasons why we read this text at Advent is because Advent comes from a Latin word adventus, which means arrival or presence, the coming of God. Now, it's important for us to realize that when Isaiah uses this language about the arrival of God, and when we see this language elsewhere in the Hebrew prophets, and even when it's used to refer to the quote-unquote second coming of Christ in the New Testament, what we're dealing with when we see or encounter this language of God's arrival or God's presence is symbolic language. This is not literal language. God doesn't literally show up in a way that we might think of God just arriving on the scene. The prophets are using artistic language here, symbolic language, to talk about a shift in the life of the people. Their position will shift from being in exile to being restored. Some prophets will even use the language of second Exodus to describe this. It will be such a powerful event that it will be like the first Exodus, and it will be a return of the people to the quote-unquote promised land where their city of Jerusalem is. But this language is not about God literally showing up. It's symbolic language to map out this shift in the positionality of the people from exile to restoration. Now, in verses 3 to 5, there are several things that happen in order to prepare the way for God's arrival. So the prophet talks about straightening of pathways and making a way through the desert, and of valleys being lifted up and mountains being brought low to create a level place. And then all the uneven places being made smooth. So there's this shift in terrain in order to prepare the way for the arrival of God. Now, in verse 5, and I'll just read it again to you, it says, after all of this terrain has been shifted, it says, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together. So the way the translators are imagining this is that all these things happen. The valleys are lifted up, the mountains are brought low, the uneven places are made plain, etc., etc. All this stuff happens, and then God's presence arrives. So it's imagining a sequence of events here. But there's actually another way to translate this. If you take out the word then, because it's an implied word that the translators have inserted, what you actually could do with this passage is to think, okay, as the valleys are being lifted up and the mountains are being brought low and all of these places are being made level and a pathway is being carved through the desert, as all of that happens, God's glory is revealed. So that's actually a powerful social message beyond the immediate context of exile and imagining the arrival of God. That actually has social implications, because what it suggests, if we were to apply this to our day, is that as we work for justice, for the leveling of the playing field, as we work to make a way where there seems to be no way, to bring about peace in our society, or a sense of commonality, a sense of brother and sisterhood, etc., as we do all of those things, we encounter the presence of God. We encounter the arrival of God. So it's not so much sequential, like do all of these things and then God arrives. It's as you do these things, you encounter the presence of God. God arrives, so to speak. So if we move on a little bit, verses 6 and following, 6 through 11, we see that God arrives in some surprising ways. So on the one hand, God in verse 10 comes with might and this powerful arm that rules. But then in verse 11, you have this tender image again. So verse 11 almost functions as a bookend, matching with verse 1. So we're back into the world of compassion, because now God is like a shepherd who gathers the lambs into his arms. So God arrives, so to speak, both with power and also tenderness. So, to come back to an application of this text for us, we might think of it as saying to us that you'll see God's glory or God's presence or God's arrival, adventus, when crooked things are fixed, or when unevenness is leveled, and unevenness in society is leveled, and where pathways are opened up in the unlikeliest of places. So it's an immediate message for the people in exile. Their situation seems totally hopeless. Like, how can we ever get ourselves out of this? And so the prophet is immediately speaking to them, saying, there will be a way in the desert for you. It's going to happen. And you're going to encounter God. But the whole social implication of the language that I've been describing reminds me of one of our few quote-unquote creeds in the UCC. It's not even really an official creed. It's more like a statement of positionality for our denomination. And here's a few phrases from that which make me think of some of the social implications of what Isaiah is talking about, or second Isaiah is talking about in this passage. So here's a portion of that quote-unquote creed. We speak of God in the UCC in ways that enrich our faith. God as mother, rock, liberator, savior, friend. No single statement fully expresses who God is. But where we see justice, peace, and compassion, where we see the leveling of the playing field, the valleys lifted up, the mountains brought low, where we see all of those things happening, we see the living God at work in history. To such a God we belong. Okay, so that's Isaiah 40. And of course, Isaiah 40 has had a life way beyond second Isaiah. Handel's Messiah quotes Isaiah 40 in some of the most powerful songs in that entire majestic piece. It has had a life beyond just the immediate context of second Isaiah. Not just in Handel's Messiah, not just second Isaiah, but this passage, Isaiah 40, is quoted in our gospel reading for this week from Mark chapter 1. So Mark is imagining the arrival of Jesus along the lines of what we just looked at in Isaiah 40. And again, arrival, adventus, the arrival of God. Okay, so that brings us to the gospel reading, and this is the gospel for the second Sunday in Advent in year B. Year B is the Gospel of Mark year. So this is the first 8 verses of Mark's gospel. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. He proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." Okay, so if we were to scan the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament, we would find at least 2 key promises among many, many others. But there are 2 key promises that emerge in various places in the Hebrew prophets. One is what we just looked at, the arrival of God as a signal of a complete change in the national positionality of the people of Israel, from being in exile to now being restored. The arrival of God symbolizes that transformation. So that's one thing. The prophets refer to the presence or the arrival of God to mark something new that's happening. But then many Hebrew prophets, including second Isaiah, although he does it in an ironic way, many Hebrew prophets will refer to an anointed one figure, sometimes called the Messiah, who is God's representative on earth and will help to bring about this transformation in the positionality of the people of Israel. So you have 2 things, the arrival of God and the arrival of the Messiah. Now, what's interesting about how the Gospels, and particularly Mark's Gospel, how they tell the story of Jesus is that they bring both of those things together into this one person of Jesus of Nazareth. So the arrival of God on the one hand, and the arrival of the anointed one, or the Christos, the Messiah, on the other. This is made explicit in Matthew's gospel when Matthew refers to Jesus at his birth as Emmanuel, God with us. And it's implied in what we're going to look at in just a couple of moments in Mark's gospel, the first 8 verses. So it's implied that God's arrival and the Messiah's arrival happen in this singular moment of the arrival of Christ. So I want to step back from Mark's gospel for just a moment and look at the whole landscape of its context, its historical and cultural context, authorship, setting, those sorts of things, to help us better understand what this gospel is, because we're going to be spending an entire year, year B in the lectionary cycle, working our way through this gospel. So in terms of date, most people date the Gospel of Mark around the year 70 CE, and that happens to be right around the time when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman army. And so one of the reasons why people date Mark to around that time is because Mark seems to know some of the details of what happened, but he doesn't know as many details as, say, Luke does. Luke adds in a lot of details about the destruction of Jerusalem that are not in Mark's gospel, which suggests that Luke had a better or vantage point historically than Mark did. Mark was sort of living through it, whereas Luke was able to look back on it, and he had more details to work with. So sometime around 70. In terms of the 4 New Testament Gospels, Mark was written first. Both Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources. So when you read Matthew and Luke, what you actually find is that most of Mark's gospel, with the exception of just a few verses, has been subsumed into both Matthew and Luke. It's actually amazing that Mark's gospel even survived historically because of that. It was taken up into these larger gospels of Matthew and Luke that contain a lot more detail about the life of Jesus. You would think that that would mean Mark would just disappear from history, but he didn't. It stuck around. And John's gospel is also dated sometime in the last part of the first century. So again, Mark's gospel, probably the first of the 4 New Testament gospels to be written. In terms of authorship, it's anonymous. All 4 New Testament Gospels are anonymous. We do not know who the writers were. Sometime in the 2nd century, in fact, one of the bishops, his name is Papias. He lived around the year 130. He's the one who identifies Mark as Mark, one of the close associates of the Apostle Peter. But there's no way, historically speaking, to know that for sure. And that's the case for all the Gospels. They're all anonymous. The titles were added in sometime in the 2nd century based on tradition that was existing at the time in the church. In terms of social setting, most people think, and it's actually the traditional position in Christian history, that Mark's gospel was written somewhere in or around the city of Rome to people living in the city of Rome. And one of the reasons why we think that actually is because of the first verse, which I'll talk about in just a second. And probably it was an ethnically mixed audience. Some were ethnic Jews who were followers of Jesus. Some were ethnic Gentiles who were also followers of Jesus. Kind of a mixed crowd that Mark is writing to. And we don't actually know the identity of Mark, but it's possible and probably even likely that he himself was an ethnic Jew. It's also possible that Greek was not his first language, because the Greek in Mark's gospel is pretty rough and rugged when compared with the much more polished Greek that you find in Luke's gospel. So it's possible that Greek was not Mark's first language, but there's no way we can know that for sure. In terms of the basic storyline of this gospel, one of the fascinating things about it is that it doesn't have a Christmas story, unlike Matthew and Luke. You just jump right into the events of Jesus' life. You're given a short introduction, and then Jesus is an adult who gets baptized. And then he launches right into his ministry. And that's actually, that sort of sense of immediacy, of jumping right into the middle of things, is matched by the abrupt ending of the Gospel of Mark. The last verse in the Gospel is chapter 16, verse 8, where the women have been met by an angel after they peered into the tomb on Easter Sunday, and they were instructed to go and tell Jesus' disciples that the tomb was empty, but instead, what Mark says is, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So Mark leaves the reader on a cliffhanger at the end. So he jumps right into the story at the beginning. He leaves the reader hanging at the end. And then in between, what we have is this fast-paced gospel. Most English translators don't even translate the Greek literally because it's so choppy. And then this happened, and then this happened, and immediately this happened. So it's this sort of pearl stringing of stories together, and this sense of urgency and immediacy, so that everything just moves very quickly as you work your way through the gospel. And then there's a shift that happens when we get to the passion story, the story of Jesus' trial and death, and things start to slow down. And Mark goes into intricate detail about the events of that evening, the night before Jesus was crucified, the events of his trial, his moment on the cross. I mean, Mark slows the narrative down. Some people, one scholar in particular, his name is Martin Collar, he actually argued that the Gospel of Mark is a passion narrative with a long introduction because of this phenomenon of the slowing down of the pacing in the Passion story. So it's a fascinating gospel to work with because it blends all of these interesting things: the rugged Greek, the sense of immediacy, the moving fast pace through the stories, jumping right into the adult life of Jesus and then ending abruptly, and then all of a sudden slowing things down when you get to the Passion story. Okay, so in terms of the text that we read, I just want to highlight a few things which make this story particularly relevant for the season of Advent. So I mentioned a second ago that we think Mark's gospel, the provenance is the city of Rome. One of the reasons why we think that is because of the first verse. So the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So almost every single word in there has some connection with what's called Roman imperial propaganda. So the political propaganda of the empire, it announcing to the residents of the empire how great it is, and particularly how significant its emperors were. One emperor in particular is, of course, Augustus, the first Roman emperor who was ultimately deified by the Senate. Augustus was referred to as Son of God. So here, Mark is deliberately connecting the identity of Jesus, pairing it up with the identity of the emperor. Jesus, of course, in Mark's view and the view of Christian history, is the true Son of God. Caesar is the parody. Then if you back up in this, the next big expression that has a connection with Roman political ideology is the phrase good news, which is actually the word gospel. So one of the aspects of imperial propaganda was the announcement of the good news, the gospel, same Greek word, of the birthday of Caesar. This was an announcement to the whole world of the good news of Caesar's birth, the Son of God. And not just that, some Roman poets referred to the age of Augustus as, quote unquote, the beginning. And again, same Greek word, those who wrote in Greek, same Greek word that Mark uses here. It's the word arche in Greek. So the beginning of the gospel of the Son of God. All three of those expressions have some connection with Roman imperial propaganda. So what Mark is doing is right out of the gate here in this gospel, he's making a theological, but a political statement that the true emperor, the true Son of God, is in fact this person, Jesus Christ. It's his story that is good news, not the emperor's story. And it's his story that marks the beginning of something new, not the emperor's story. So just in the first verse, Mark has made several connections with Roman imperial ideology and made a strong case for a provenance in the city of Rome for this gospel, because that audience in particular would have gotten what Mark was up to here. And incidentally, there are two other places in Mark's gospel that almost parody the Roman Empire. So one is in Mark chapter 5, where Jesus encounters this man who's possessed by a legion of demons. A legion, it says. Well, the Roman legion was the Roman army. So there's a parody there that the demonic force is the legionary force. And then what Jesus does in that story is orders legion into the pigs, who then rush down the side of a cliff and then drown themselves in the sea. It's almost like a joke that the Roman legion ends up in the least kosher animal, the pig, and then commits suicide. So it's something that people may have listened to and then laughed at. It's sort of like a political joke. So that's one. The other connection that Mark makes in almost a parody way is the Roman centurion who stands at the foot of the cross and says, truly this man was the Son of God, not the emperor. Now here you have the Roman centurion overseeing the crucifixion who converts at the end. And it's possible that Mark is making an even bolder statement there, saying all of Rome ultimately will convert to this true Son of God. So some interesting connections there between Mark and the Roman context. Okay, as we move a little further here, verse 2, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. Now, what's interesting about this is that the first Hebrew prophet that Mark quotes is not Isaiah. See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. That comes from Malachi chapter 3. So there is a problem here. Mark is saying, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, but he doesn't get to Isaiah until verse 3. The middle part of verse 2 there, he's actually quoting a different Hebrew prophet. So if you have an NRSV Bible, you can go down and follow the footnote there. It's footnote C in my Bible. And it says, footnote C at the bottom, other ancient authorities read in the prophets. So what we actually have here is a discrepancy in the copies of Mark's gospel. Some copies of Mark's gospel, and there are hundreds and hundreds of copies of Mark's gospel in Greek. Some of those copies read as we have it in our English text, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. Other copies change it to as it is written in the prophets. Most likely, that second possibility was added in by copyists who felt that Mark had made a mistake here. Because most likely what Mark wrote was, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah. And the copyists came in and said, hang on here. That's got to be wrong, because the first prophet that Mark quotes is Malachi, not Isaiah. So then some copyists changed it to, as it is written in the prophets, to smooth out the reading and to fix the mistake. Just one of those little interesting tidbits in biblical scholarship. So in fact, Mark quotes two Hebrew prophets here, Malachi chapter 3, and then our text that we just looked at, Isaiah chapter 40. So what Mark is doing here by quoting these two prophets is to actually make a theological point. So both of these Old Testament passages, both Malachi 3 and Isaiah chapter 40, talk about making preparations for the arrival of God. In Isaiah 40, it was, mountains being brought low, valleys being lifted up, making a way in the desert, etc., etc. As these things happen, God arrives. In Malachi chapter 3, it's a messenger who prepares the way for the arrival of God. So what's interesting is that by citing both of these Old Testament passages right out of the gate, Mark is revealing the identities of two of his key characters at the beginning of the story, John the Baptist and Jesus the Christ, or Jesus the Messiah. So in verse 4, he says, John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness. So John appears right after Mark quotes from these two Hebrew prophets, talking about preparing the way for the arrival of God. So what Mark is suggesting here is that John the Baptist is this messenger talked about in Malachi chapter 3. And John the Baptist is this voice crying out in the wilderness from Isaiah chapter 40. So John is both the messenger from Malachi 3 and the voice in the wilderness from Isaiah 40. And it's interesting, if you go back and look at the Hebrew prophet Malachi chapter 4 says that this messenger is the great prophet Elijah, who comes back to announce the arrival of God. Well, as you move through Mark's gospel, what you find, you get a little further on in Mark chapter 9, that Jesus identifies John the Baptist with Elijah. So this brings us back to Malachi. The messenger of Malachi announces the arrival of God. That messenger is Elijah. In Mark chapter 1, the messenger is John the Baptist. And in Mark chapter 9, John the Baptist is identified with Elijah, or an Elijah second coming in a way. And of course, the clothes that John the Baptist is wearing resemble the clothes that Elijah wore. He's a hairy dude, he has rugged clothes, and he has a leather belt around his waist. Same expressions that are used of Elijah in the book of 2 Kings. So we get a window into how Mark sees the identity of John the Baptist. He is this messenger. He is this voice crying out in the wilderness. He's the one who's preparing the way for the arrival of God. So that brings us to the identity of Jesus. So in verse 1, Mark tells us that Jesus is the Son of God. And throughout the gospel, it's the people who shouldn't know who he is that in fact know who he is. So the demons know who Jesus is. The religious leaders who are his opponents know who Jesus is. And yet his own disciples never quite figure it out. There's a great confession of faith that Peter utters in Mark chapter 8. But by the end of the gospel, Peter has denied even knowing Jesus, and he breaks down and weeps, and he's never reconciled in Mark's gospel. It's in the other gospels that you see Peter being reconciled to Jesus. But in Mark's gospel, it ends tragically for Peter. He never gets it. And in the end, he just denies even knowing Jesus. So the ones you don't expect to know Jesus actually know him. They know him as Son of God, the demons in particular. And the ones who should know who he is, the disciples, never quite figure it out. But in Mark chapter 1, by quoting these two Old Testament passages about the arrival of God, what Mark is in effect saying is that here is God. God appearing in a way that nobody expected, and in this powerful presence of the person of Jesus. So it's a mysterious arrival of God. It's an unexpected arrival of God. It's an adventus. Hence, reading Mark chapter 1 for the second Sunday of Advent in year B. So if we put together Isaiah 40 and Mark chapter 1, I think we come away with an Advent message, a message of preparation, but also a message of consolation, which comes through so clearly in Isaiah 40. Then we can probe even a little bit deeper, and this is what I want to end with. That those who are suffering or in need of consolation will find that God can and does arrive, sometimes in unexpected ways, to uplift the spirit and to shower people with grace. So Advent is about preparing ourselves to experience this grace of God by beginning to look for it in unexpected places and listen for it in the voices of unexpected people who end up being messengers like John the Baptist. Okay, I want to save just a couple of minutes. If you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to interact with them. Otherwise, I will see you next week for Advent 3. But I'll save a couple of minutes here if anyone has a question or a comment. All right. See you next week.